as Lee said, thank you all for coming to this opening event of the Penn Federalist Society's Conference on Conscience and the Law. And thank you all for coming with open minds, as Professor Coors just encouraged me to reiterate. I am Dan Sheely, the director of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, and I consider it a privilege for the Institute to support this first lecture by Dr. Robert George. So thank you, Lee, and the rest of the Federalist Society for this opportunity. It's now my personal honor to introduce Dr. George, who is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, which is a chair previously held by former President Woodrow Wilson. I'm not sure if he considers that an honor or not, but where he also directs the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. Among the many reasons that it's appropriate to have him leading off this conference on conscience is that he was just appointed last year as the chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He had previously served from 1993 to 1998 as a presidential appointee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and from 2002 to 2009 as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. A renowned scholar of constitutional interpretation, George himself was a drafter of a legal manifesto known as the Manhattan Declaration, in which churches and religious charities promised resistance to the point of civil disobedience against any legislation that might implicate them in grave violations of their consciences. He's the co-founder of the Renewal Forum, an organization fighting the sexual trafficking and commercial exploitation of women and children. He has been awarded the Canterbury Medal of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, as well as the Honorific Medal for the Defense of Human Rights of the Republic of Poland, just to name a few distinctions among many honorary doctorates in law, ethics, science, and humane letters. Also completed a few degrees the conventional way. George completed his JD at Harvard Law School, his MTS at Harvard Divinity School, and his DPhil at Oxford. But he completed his BA just a few miles away at Swarthmore, and no doubt considers the Philadelphia area the most formative influence on his academic career, or at least the site of the public launch of his prolific musical career, where at Swarthmore he led the Robbie George and Friends Country Bluegrass Band. But as I just learned, that's actually inaccurate because he was already strumming when in middle school for the college crowd. So I don't know if you brought the materials with you today, maybe just his lecture notes. But for his teaching, something I can sort of personally attest to being one of his students, to Professor George's reputation as a beloved teacher from students of all political stripes, all of whom can expect an equal dose of grilling, and most people love him for it, including, I was thinking that my own impressions were echoed, I discovered on Wikipedia, by our Supreme Court Justice Kagan, who praised George as, quote, one of the nation's most respected legal theorists, saying that the respect he gained was due to his sheer brilliance, the analytical power of his arguments, the range of his knowledge, and a deeply principled conviction, a profound and enduring integrity. So I don't wish to add anything to Justice Kagan's words, simply to extend our welcome to Professor George today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan, and congratulations on the founding of Collegium. Congratulations to you, too, Matt. It's great to be here with my former students, Dan Sheely and Matt O'Brien and Rob Day, another one over here, and with some wonderful friends on the faculty. I certainly see Stefanos Bibas here and my dear, dear old friend, Alan Coors, who is the winner of the Door Prize, since you mentioned it, Dan. My new CD, Songs of the Mountains and Seas, that's for you. The truth is that little boys in West Virginia are issued banjos at birth, so it's not as if you have a choice as to whether to be a bluegrass musician. It comes as a birthright. Well, I am very pleased to be opening your conference, and I wish you every success with your deliberation in the course of the day. The issues are very interesting, of course, and timely. You're going to be talking later today about the more practical aspects of the issue. I'm going to launch us in our discussions by shifting up to a higher level of abstraction. It's always easier to come down than to go up. So let me start us up at a fairly high level of abstraction, and then we'll see where it goes from there. I want to talk about two concepts of liberty and conscience, key concepts, liberty and conscience, in the debates that we are having now, these very timely debates. With its health and human services mandates to employers to provide health insurance coverage that includes abortion-inducing drugs, sterilizations, and contraceptives, the Obama administration has put the issue of the meaning and scope of religious liberty back on the agenda for public deliberation and debate. And in itself, it's a good thing. It's high time that we had a public debate in this country about the meaning and scope of religious freedom. The mandates have, of course, been challenged in federal courts around the country, and the Supreme Court has just recently heard oral argument on the question whether, pursuant to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, the government will be required to grant conduct exemptions for employers who conscientiously object, such as the Green family, who are the principals of the Hobby Lobby chain. And down the line we have specifically religious groups such as the Little Sisters of the Poor, or religious institutions such as Wheaton College or Belmont Abbey College, and so forth. Now, of course, the administration contends that its mandates do not violate religious freedom or the rights of conscience properly understood. Indeed, its defenders argue that the mandates, which contain, as it stands, only the narrowest of exemptions, are actually necessary to protect the freedom and rights of conscience of women who wish to use contraceptives and abortifacient drugs such as Ella, some of which they deny are actually abortion-inducing, or to avail themselves of sterilization procedures. So we find people on both sides of the debate, and this is really my opening point. It's not a one-sided debate about religious freedom or a debate that pits the concepts of freedom and conscience against some countervailing, different set of values or rights. No, we find people on both sides of this debate claiming to be the true defenders of liberty and conscience, or the defenders of the true, correct concepts or understandings of liberty and conscience. It would be well for us then, especially as we begin a day's reflection on these issues, to pause here at the beginning to reflect in a philosophical way on the moral foundations of competing concepts, or conceptions, if I can shift to the Dworkinian language, of liberty and conscience. So to that end, I want to invite you to think with me a little about the ideas of two great modern thinkers, two of modern intellectual history's most distinguished thinkers, John Stuart Mill and John Henry Newman. Mill and Newman were, to my mind, certainly the greatest English men of letters of the Victorian period of the 19th century. Both were men of deep and wide learning, as well as men of formidable intelligence. These were a pair of really bright lights. Both wrote powerful defenses of freedom. Freedom and conscience were important themes for both Mill and Newman. Mill's was mainly, although not exclusively, most prominently perhaps I should say, not exclusively, in the form of an essay that many of you, I'm sure, encountered in your political theory courses or moral philosophy courses as an undergraduate, the essay entitled On Liberty, published in 1869. In that essay, you'll recall, Mill defended what he described as, and I quote him, one very simple principle that is entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion, unquote. It's the burden of On Liberty to defend that allegedly one very simple principle, which deals absolutely with the dealings of society, with the individual, whether the force being contemplated is the force of governmental coercion or what he calls the moral coercion of public opinion, what today we would call political correctness or something like that. Mill's not just interested in physical force or legal mandates. His concept of freedom is one very simple principle, is meant to apply absolutely to all forms of coercion, including the moral coercion of public opinion. Now, this principle, the one very simple principle, has been labeled the harm principle. That's probably the language that your undergraduate political theory professor used when he introduced you to On Liberty. Now, let me quote him again to give you his very specific interpretation of his own principle, his account of his own principle. Quote, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others, to do so would be wise or even right," unquote. I have to read them. Alan, I know you could quote these without looking at the text. Now, Mill's principle is frequently invoked, not only in classrooms, but in cocktail party conversation. I mean, it's the most common thing in the world, I think, to hear somebody say, well, look, you know, the only reason you should be permitted to interfere with me or I should be permitted to interfere with you is to prevent you from doing something bad to me or me from doing something bad to you, right? It's taken almost as if it's a self-evident principle that, gosh, especially when it comes to the government, I mean, the only possible justification for the government outlawing something or even regulating it is to prevent harm to others, right? I mean, it's obvious, right? Well, it hasn't been obvious to everybody forever, even in freedom-loving societies. It's kind of a big deal. Mill gets a lot of credit for defending this idea, for making it popular. So it's frequently invoked in cocktail party conversations and in freshman class discussions, at least until the philosophy professor starts to press on it a bit, as if it's self-evident. It has, however, been sharply criticized, even by philosophers of a generally liberal persuasion, such as the late and very great H.L.A. Hart of Oxford University, the professor of jurisprudence in the University of Oxford in the period from the late 1950s to the 70s, who argued that the one very simple principle, the harm principle, is simply too sweeping in ruling out paternalistic reasons for limiting certain forms of liberty. Just too sweeping, just too extreme, according to Hart. Yes, there have to be limits on paternalism. Hart would agree with that. As I say, he's a person of a generally liberal, was a person of a generally liberal disposition. But let's not go overboard here, he argued, as Mill does. Let's not be absolutists. Mill says it's the deal, this principle applies absolutely whenever the issue is compulsion or control. No, Hart argues, we need to leave some legitimate room, surely, for paternalistic intervention by the state. Perhaps laws mandating the wearing of seat belts, or laws requiring you to wear motorcycle helmets, or perhaps laws forbidding the use of damaging and addictive drugs, or what have you. Now, more conservative philosophers, I myself among them, have been even more skeptical and critical. For present purposes, though, I'm less interested in the scope or breadth of Mill's principle, which is what Hart was really interested in, or even with its content, than with its ground, because I think that's what will matter as our conversations continue today with the panels and other speakers. What exactly is it now, according to Mill, that provides the moral basis for respecting people's liberty? What's the basis of that obligation on you or me or on society or on the state to not interfere with the freedom of others, except where absolutely necessary to prevent harm to others? Now, Mill, who's a very clear writer and a very candid writer, as well as a clear thinker, doesn't hide the ball. Although, despite not hiding the ball, what I'm about to quote to you, which should jump off the page, I should think, of any reader of On Liberty, is very often ignored or missed. But here it is. He's not hiding the ball. Quote, "It is proper to state that I forego any advantage which could be derived to my argument from the idea of abstract right as a thing independent of utility. I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, but it must be utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being." That one you don't hear so much in cocktail party conversation or in freshman philosophy classes. There you hear regularly appeals to what Mill dismisses as abstract right. Well, damn it, I just have a right that you not interfere with my freedom to do whatever the hell I want, so long as I'm not hurting you or somebody else. You know, the minor premise in the argument is, damn it. That's not Mill. I forego any advantage to be derived from my argument by appeal to abstract right as something independent of utility. So here we see that, at least as far as Mill's concerned, contrary to what now 100 years and more of critics have claimed against him, at least as far as Mill's concerned, there's no contradiction or even tension between Mill's utilitarianism and Mill's libertarianism. Now, lots of people who regard themselves today as strong Millians reject Mill's utilitarianism, and not unreasonably, fearing that if utility is the arbiter, as he says, the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, well, then couldn't liberty be lost whenever the utilitarian calculation mechanism churns out the answer repress or suppress, limit liberty? However that may be, and whatever's to be said against Mill or in defense of him on the question of the compatibility, ultimate compatibility of his utilitarianism with his libertarianism, it is clear that Mill does ground his principle of liberty and the obligation to respect it in the belief that respect for liberty will, in the end, in its consequences, be net beneficial. But then we have to ask the next question, and it's obvious, it's in your minds already. Beneficial to whom? Well, of course, the community, right? Well, which community? The local community? The national community? What if there's a conflict between the interests of the local community, which may be in suppression, say, of a form of speech, a particular liberty that Mill is very, very interested in protecting and defends quite brilliantly in the second chapter of On Liberty. Conflict between the interests of the community and the interests of the nation. Or maybe it's not the community of the local community or the national community. Perhaps it's the international community or the imperial community. As a Victorian, Mill's interested in that. Well, Mill doesn't exactly say, and of course this is a classic problem for utilitarianism generally, including for the thought of Mill's own great teacher, Jeremy Bentham. Mill does, however, say this, as we've seen. The concept of utility that must govern is the criterion of morality in our choosing, and as the ground of the moral obligation, including the obligation to respect and protect liberty, must be utility, and let me quote him again here, in the largest sense, as grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. That concept of utility. Now, I submit to you that this business about the permanent interests of man as a progressive being is the very opposite of some throwaway line. This is doing heavy-duty work in Mill's argument, in his utilitarianism generally, and in the effort to square his utilitarianism with his libertarianism, to make utility a secure ground for the principle of liberty, and the particular principle of liberty that he has here, the harm principle. So it is utility. He really does forego, however many times his readers miss it. He's serious. He really does forego appeal to abstract right, and it should go without saying. He completely has nothing to do with, he's as far as you can possibly be, from the most familiar of all cocktail party defenses of the harm principle, and that's the idea that there is no such thing as moral truth. So there's no such thing as moral truth, you shouldn't get to impose your values on me. Mill was like a really smart guy. Although you don't have to be too smart to figure out pretty quickly that that's going to be a self-defeating principle. You know, if there is no such thing as moral truth, there's absolutely no moral reason I shouldn't impose my values on you just because I want to. So Mill sees the problem as a moral problem, and he takes seriously his obligation as the defender of a view to give a moral argument for the view, to identify a moral ground for the liberty principle and for the obligation of all of us to respect it. So note two things about Mill's defense of liberty, whether it's freedom of speech, which, as I've said, is a freedom that Mill treats quite central and treats quite beautifully in the second chapter, and I think very, very ably in the second chapter of On Liberty. Much to be learned from that today. If you don't read anything else in On Liberty, go back and read the second chapter with the contemporary intellectual milieu very much in mind. Or whether it's freedom of religion, which interests Mill less, although he doesn't disdain it, or any other freedom. The first of the two things is this: the ultimate basis of the moral claims of freedom, is social benefit, utility. It's not abstract right. Second, Mill's view of humanity is imbued, saturated with 19th century optimism and belief in progress. That's really what that business about the permanent interests of man as a progressive being is all about. Man, according to Mill, is naturally good, a progressive being. He will therefore, in his cultural and personal maturity, remember I laid some emphasis as I was quoting him on his word civilized. This principle is only meant to apply in civilized societies. But once we become civilized, we human beings, and when we've attained cultural and personal maturity, not children, not barbarians, but in our maturity, do well by ourselves and by others if we're only left free of paternalistic and moralistic constraints to engage in what Mill elsewhere calls experiments in living, from which the individual corporately, as well as an individual, will learn what conduces to happiness and what does not. It's by these experiments in living, and they're made possible by liberty, that we as a community and each of us as individuals learns what's utility maximizing and what isn't. What's for our personal development and what's contrary to it. Freed from the old moralisms and superstitions, including the religious ones, liberated to be what by nature we are, we human beings will flourish because we're progressive. We're progressive beings. We're heading in the right direction. Those old moralisms and superstitions, far from preventing the human being from descending into vice and degradation, as perhaps other philosophers had argued, or even assisting the human being in avoiding those horrible consequences. No, these old moralisms and superstitions don't do that. They don't help. Rather, they tie the human being down. They tie him down and wound his spirit. They profoundly impede, and they have impeded, his full flourishing and self-realization. Free to do as they please, free to do what they want to do, so long as they do not do harm to others, mature persons in mature cultures will, on the whole, fits and starts, but on the whole, want to do good, productive, utility-enhancing things. And he supposes that there's no real danger of regression to the former condition of things in barbarian societies and in small threatened communities, in both of which cases, once again, Mill's defense of liberty did not, he thought, hold good. Holds good only for mature persons in mature societies. Now, I began my own academic career by writing several articles and a book that were rather severely critical of the concept and defense of liberty that readers are offered in Mill. I see no reason today to alter any of those criticisms. But Mill was, in my judgment, by no means completely wrong. The naive optimism and progressivism, they were wrong to be sure, although he was hardly alone in those beliefs. First World War and the apparent irrationality of it, the perplexity about what even caused it, sobered people up. But Mill, of course, is writing in a period before that. And the utilitarianism? Well, I think that's wrong too. Obviously, this is a big and important debate. There are very serious and credible and brilliant defenders of utilitarianism. But that seems to me to be an error as well. A spectacular one, but an error. The Christian philosophical anthropology, Mill regarded as a relic of superstitious ages, has proved, in my judgment, to be far more plausible and reliable than the alternative that Mill quite uncritically accepted. Man is a progressive being. And utilitarianism and other forms of consequentialism in ethics are, for reasons that I've laid out elsewhere and which many others have also developed, but won't go into in great detail here, are in the end unworkable and even incoherent. I think the most fundamental reason for that is that they presuppose a kind of commensurability of human values, of aspects of human well-being, flourishing, and the particular instantiations of those values that simply does not square either with the reality, that is, the way things really are about human goods as aspects of our well-being and fulfillment, or with the conditions of deliberation and choice themselves. The basic aspects of our well-being and fulfillment that together constitute the ideal of integral human flourishing, all-round human flourishing, are reducible neither to each other nor to some common substance, goodness, or factor which they share. So in my view, we predicate goodness of all the various aspects of our well-being and fulfillment as human persons, not univocally, as if it was the same substance just manifested differently in friendship, let's say, than it is in the pursuit of intellectual knowledge or than it is in the development of critical skills, or manifested in different degrees. No, we predicate goodness of the various aspects of the overall human good, of Aristotle's eudaimonia, only analogically. The good thing, the thing that we're referring to when we call friendship a human good, or the pursuit of knowledge, or the development of skills in chess or ballet or football, good. The thing in common is that each is capable of providing a more than merely instrumental reason why someone would choose it. A reason that doesn't depend for its intelligibility as a reason on any further or deeper reason or sub-rational motivating factor to which it's a mere means. that's the nature, it seems to me, the character of our well-being as human beings. We can't create a meter that will tell us how much goodness we've got in friendship that will enable it to be compared with how much goodness we've got in the pursuit of knowledge, or how much goodness there might be in my particular friendship with my friend and former student Matt O'Brien, and how much goodness there is in, let's say, an evening the two of us spend reading and discussing Shakespeare together, or something like that. So the human goods differ substantially as distinct dimensions of our flourishing and fulfillment of our capacities as human beings, rational animals. And they are, as such, incommensurable in ways that render hopeless the utilitarian project of identifying a particular option for choice, or even a rule by which we can guide our choosing that promises, to quote Bentham, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or to use a language that would be more in line with contemporary utilitarians, an option or a rule, the choosing in line with which would enable us to produce the net best proportion of benefit to harm overall and in the long run. I don't think there's any reality that corresponds to that idea, whether it's in its Benthamite form, greatest good of the greatest number, or greatest happiness of the greatest number, or in the more sophisticated contemporary form, that which will produce the net best proportion of benefit to harm overall and in the long run. Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot compare human goods for other reasons or on other scales, and even in certain ways rank them. But it does mean as they figure in options for morally significant choosing, there is a certain incommensurability which renders hopeless the task of working the utilitarian calculus. All right, so I've declared that I think Mill is by no means completely wrong, and then I've told you the two respects in which I think he's profoundly wrong. So where do I think he's right? Well, he's right, in my opinion, precisely in foregoing any appeal to abstract right and looking for the moral ground of liberty in a consideration of the well-being and fulfillment, the flourishing of human beings. What he in Chapter 3 of On Liberty describes as the end of man, end in the sense of telos, the end, telos, of man, and characterizes there as bringing human beings themselves closer to the best that they can be. That all sounds rather Aristotelian, and I say, amen, brother. Now, people have rights, I agree with Mill, including rights to liberties, important liberties, that I would affirm, although I don't affirm Mill's harm principle, I would affirm many liberties Mill would affirm just as enthusiastically as he does, because there is a human good. There are human goods. There is a human well-being that is advanced and protected by respect for liberty. Ends or purposes that not only conduce to, but constitute our flourishing as the kinds of creatures we are, rational animals. The full defense of any particular liberty, then, including the freedom of religion, requires the identification and defense of those human goods, those aspects of our well-being and fulfillment that liberty secures, protects, preserves, advances. Now, in a recent paper that I've given elsewhere, most recently at Georgetown, I offered a detailed account and defense of religious freedom as necessary for the protection of the human good of what I called religion. Not a particular religion, but rather religion considered as the active quest for spiritual truth, for the answers to the great existential questions. Where do I come from? What is my destiny? Is there a more than merely human, transcendent meaning, a source of meaning and value? Is there a higher law under which the merely human law, the positive law of the state, stands in judgment, and so forth? And the effort to live with integrity and authenticity in line with one's best judgments, whatever they are, including atheistic judgments, regarding the ultimate sources of meaning and value, and to fulfill one's obligations in spiritual and moral matters in both the public and private dimensions of one's life. That seems to me a profoundly important human good. One that it's very easy, as a matter of fact, to grasp. One that Richard Dawkins can grasp. Even Dawkins, who was an old friend of mine, we were colleagues in New College, Oxford, had many lunches and coffees together. Even Dawkins would think that it would be an impoverished life, just insofar, impoverished just to the extent that one never bothered to think about those great questions. Where do I come from? What is my destiny, or our destiny? Why is there something rather than nothing? Is there a transcendent source or not of meaning and value? Is there a law of justice or morality that's higher than the positive law of the state? Something under which the mere positive law of the state stands in judgment or under judgment. He would want his children, as you would want your children, as I want my children, to think about those questions. And not only to think about them, but to live lives of authenticity and integrity in line with their best judgments in conscience of where the truth, as a matter of fact, is. You don't want them leading an inauthentic life of pretending to be believers when they're not, or pretending to be unbelievers when actually they are, which you can be incentivized to do in lots of different ways. No, you'd want your kid, because you care about your kid, having a full life, a rich life, a human life. You'd care about your kid asking those questions, doing his best to answer those questions, living a life of integrity in line with his best conscientious judgments. Now, John Stuart Mill, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't greatly interested in religious freedom, though, as I said, he did not, as far as I can tell, disdain it. The trouble, I think, was that he had something of a tin ear for religion, at least in its traditional manifestations. His harm principle would, of course, extend to religious activity and practices, no doubt about that. But I doubt that he viewed those activities and practices as, in themselves as having much value. They would, I suspect, he believed, soon wither away in an age of freedom, since man is a progressive being, and freedom brings with it enlightenment. So there might still be religion, but it would be not the old-fashioned supernatural religion. It would be a kind of religion of humanity. In fact, he sketched something like this. And you find it more fully developed in a very similar figure, though not quite as magisterial a one, in the American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey. If you have to look at Dewey's book, A Common Faith, you see him in the spirit of Mill trying to develop a non-supernaturalist, non-theistic religion, and even this is a good one, a non-theistic concept of God. Very much in the spirit of Mill. Now, by contrast, John Henry Newman did not have a tin ear for religion. He was a religious genius, one of the greatest produced in the modern era. And his understanding of religion enabled him to produce an account of freedom, in particular the freedom of conscience, that I regard as superior, quite substantially superior to Mill's, and from which I think we have a lot to learn today. My students all know who Mill was. Very few know who Newman was. Cornell West and I were teaching a seminar at Princeton in 2009, and we assigned, among other authors, Mill, which everybody had heard of, and Newman. And on that occasion, we weren't interested in Newman on liberty. We were interested in Newman on education. And so we assigned his great book, his collection of essays, really, called The Idea of a University. The students loved it. They thought it was cool. They were really cooking. The discussion was fantastic. And I was surprised, because it is a bit, what shall I say, Matt, Baroque in its style. But it wasn't alien to them. Now, I later figured out why. I mean, it's just, the book's talking about what they were doing, getting a college education, and they could relate to that. And it was, as I say, a great discussion. The students were enjoying it. And it occurred to me to ask, just out loud, I shouldn't have, but I did, gosh, tell me, how many of you, now what do we have, 18, valedictorians, perfect SAT scores, all that stuff. How many of you, before coming to this seminar, had ever heard, before doing this week's reading or enrolling in the course, how many of you had ever heard of John Henry Newman? Very low standard, right? What, not how many of you have read any of John Henry Newman? How many of you have heard of John Henry Newman? Not a single hand went up. Now, of course, Newman is famous in the intellectual world for not just one thing, but several things. His writings on liberty, his writings on education, his writings on theology, his writings on epistemology. And of course, he's famous for being a famous convert to Catholicism. You know, the dean of St. Mary's, Anglican dean of St. Mary's Church in Oxford, who from the pulpit went over to the other side, went over to Catholicism. And you know what happens when you're, given the long and not altogether happy history of relations between Anglicans and Catholics in England. You know, when the Catholic Church gets a convert like Mill, they really blow it up into a big, like Newman, they blow it up into a big thing. They lionize the guy. You know, he's an international figure. Now there's a movement to make him a saint. Now, 24% of Princeton's students are Catholic, so I have to think that there had to be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 Catholics, 6, maybe among the 18 in the room. But not even the Catholic students had heard of John Stuart Mill. John Henry Newman. They'd all heard of Mill because of those freshman philosophy classes and perhaps even those cocktail conversations. Now, like Mill, Newman does not appeal in his defense of liberty to any concept of abstract right. They're on the same page on that one. Instead, Newman locates the foundations of honorable freedoms, the freedoms we really should respect, in a concern for human excellence, human well-being, human flourishing, arete, eudaimonia. Newman has, for me, the immense advantage over Mill of believing in human fallenness, what Christians call original sin, which Chesterton quipped is the one Catholic dogma for which there is overwhelming empirical evidence. And so Newman is spared naive optimism and faith in human progress. Moreover, as a serious Christian, a utilitarian approach to moral decision-making and all that this presupposes and entails has no appeal whatsoever to Newman. So he spared that too. So he spared the two, what I think are errors that Mar Mills thought. He's cognizant of both, he being Newman, is cognizant of both the need for restraints on freedom, lest men descend into vice and self-degradation, and on the supreme importance of central freedoms as conditions for the realization of values that truly are constitutive of the integral flourishing of men and women as free and rational creatures, creatures whose freedom and rationality reflects, in Newman's view as a Christian, human beings having been made in the very image and likeness of God. So he's got quite a robust conception of freedom. You need freedom in order to lead a human life. You need freedom in order to realize many human goods. You also need freedom to protect against abuses by government overreaching, tyranny. There are lots of arguments for freedom, but neither does he appeal to abstract right, nor does he choose the option of appealing to some form of utilitarianism. Now, Newman's dedication to the rights of conscience is particularly well known to those who've heard of him at all. Even long after his conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism, Newman famously toasted, and I quote, "The Pope, yes, but conscience first." That was a toast he suggested in a letter later published to the Duke of Norfolk, the numero uno Catholic aristocrat in England, in 1875. In the book, somehow the subject of after-dinner toasts and religion had been brought in, and Newman says, gosh, I just wish we would just leave religion out of after-dinner toasts, right? Can we leave that subject? We talk about religion all the time anyway. Let's leave it out of after-dinner. But if we have to bring it in to after-dinner toasts, yes, he's a Catholic by now, Of course I'll toast the Pope, but conscience first. Our obligation to follow conscience, in other words, is in a profound sense for Newman primary and even overriding as a moral duty. This isn't just the obligation not to interfere in somebody else's conscience. It's the obligation to actually act on your own. Follow your own conscience, even if it takes you away from the Pope. Now, as a Catholic and eventually a cardinal, surely he believes there's a duty to follow the teachings of the Pope. Well, yes, he does think there is a duty. As a Catholic, especially as a church leader, he affirms that with all his heart. But he does the intellectual exercise of imagining that a conflict were to arise between the teachings of the Pope and the requirements of conscience. One's duties in conscience, formed as best one can form one's conscience. Well, in that case, it is the obligations of conscience that must prevail. Now that really sounds liberal, right, in the modern sense of liberal. I mean, there are lots of liberal Catholics who don't like various teachings of the Pope. They like some of the teachings of the current Pope a little better, but, popes generally, they're not too wild about moral teachings of the Pope about marriage or sex or things like that. And they might be tempted to shout, "Right on, Brother Newman." But I think that would be true only if they didn't know the rest of the story. For Newman, though the most powerful defender of freedom of conscience, held a view of conscience and of freedom that is really quite deeply at odds with the liberal ideology that is dominant in significant sectors of the secular culture, especially the intellectual culture, including the intellectual culture within the Catholic Church. Let's permit Newman to speak for himself, for he had already identified in the 19th century the tendency of thought about rights, liberty, and conscience that would become much more prominent in the 20th century and now in the 21st. So here's Newman. Conscience has rights because it has duties. But in this age, with a large portion of the public, it is the very right and freedom of conscience to dispense with conscience. Conscience is a stern monitor. But in this century, it has been superseded by a counterfeit, which the 18 centuries prior to it never heard of and could not have mistaken for it if they had. It is the right of self-will, unquote. So now we have Newman telling us what he means by conscience when he toasts conscience ahead of the Pope, even ahead of the Pope. It's conscience as a stern monitor, not conscience as the right of self-will. Conscience as an issuer of thou shalt and thou shalt nots, not conscience as the permissions department. And why does conscience have rights? Because conscience has duties. So conscience, as Newman understood it, is actually the very opposite of autonomy in the modern liberal sense of that term. Now its relationship to what Kant himself, for example, meant by autonomy, that's a more complex question, I think. But as the term autonomy figures in contemporary debates, I think it's fair to say Newman's got a position that is the reverse of it. Conscience is not a writer of permission slips. It's not in the business of licensing us to do as we please or conferring on us a right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. I don't have to tell you where that came from. Rather, conscience is one's last best judgment, specifying the bearing of moral principles one grasps intellectually, yet in no way makes up for oneself on concrete proposals for action. Shall I do this or shall I not do this? Shall I do that rather than this? Conscience identifies duties under the moral law. It speaks of what one must do and what one must not do. Understood in this way, conscience really is what Newman said it is, a stern monitor. Now contrast this understanding of conscience with what Newman condemns as its counterfeit, conscience as self-will, conscience as a matter of emotion or feeling rather than reason, the stern monitor. It's concerned not so much with the identification of what one has a duty to do or not do, one's feelings and desires, preferences to the contrary notwithstanding, but rather and precisely with sorting out one's feelings. Conscience as the identifier of permissions, not obligations, licensing behavior by establishing that one doesn't feel bad about doing it, that one is comfortable with it, or at least one doesn't feel badly enough about doing it that one prefers the option of not doing it. Newman's key distinction is between conscience authentically understood as the stern monitor and self-will, conscience as the permissions department. His core insight for those of us who think he's onto something here is that conscience has rights because it has duties. So there's no appeal to abstract right. There's something behind the rights. That is the duties. The duties are in turn what they are because human well-being is constituted as it is. The duties represent specifications of the integral directiveness of the human good in its variety. The right to follow one's conscience and the obligation to respect conscience, especially in matters of faith, where conscience takes the form of religious liberty, obtain not because people as autonomous agents should be able to do as they please. They obtain rather and are stringent and sometimes overriding because people have duties and an obligation to follow them, or in any event, have a sense or a judgment of their duties. They might happen in a particular case to be wrong about it, and a duty for the sake of their own authenticity and integrity to follow it. The right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, to avoid doing what one judges one must not do. Whether one welcomes the obligation or rather must overcome a strong aversion in order to fulfill that obligation. That's the case, the kind of case Newman has in mind. He's not imagining that you're always going to want to do what your conscience tells you to do, conscience considered as your last best judgment of right and wrong. He imagines that very often in this fallen world, with human beings constituted actually the way we are, original sin and all that, there'll be lots of times when we're going to not want to do what our conscience tells us to do. We'd prefer a more polite and tame conscience than the one we've actually got. If there's a form of words that sums up the antithesis, if we can go via negativa here for a moment, the antithesis of Newman's view of conscience as a stern monitor, it's the slogan that will forever stand as a verbal monument to the me generation. You remember this? If it feels good, do it. That's what Newman is standing up against. Now that, by the way, is not Mill's view. Mill is not a proto-me generation, if it feels good, do it sort of guy. Although, Alan will probably remember this or correct me if I get it wrong, he has had critics, some of Mill's critics, I think Gertrude Himmelfarb is one, who think they perceive in the writings of this Victorian figure the seeds of 1968, the seeds of me generation permissive. That's an interesting interpretative debate. Is Mill kind of a proto-68 guy or not? I think he himself, if he could be, it's an anachronism to imagine such a thing could be brought back. I would imagine he himself would be appalled by that thought. But, often we're appalled by truths about ourselves. So let's not try to resolve it right here. I just flagged the issue that some people perceive that in Mill. But it certainly wasn't Mill's own sense of his own philosophy, and I'm certainly prepared to credit that. Now, of course, properly understood and even toasted ahead of the Pope, there are limits to the rights of conscience, and Newman understood this. There are limits of conscience even in the fulfillment of perceived vocational obligations or institutional apostolates and other religious duties. I mean, there are limits to the consciences and conscience rights even of the little sisters of the poor. The little sisters can't go into court and argue, at least as a moral matter, couldn't argue. We need to be legally free to do whatever we want to do. Obviously, that won't work. Unspeakable wrongs can be done by people seeking sincerely to get right with God or the gods or their conception of ultimate reality or divinity, whatever it is. The presumption in favor of respecting liberty must, for the sake of the human good and the dignity of the human person as a free and rational creature, be powerful and broad, but it can't be unlimited. It just can't be. Even the great end of getting right with God or living a life of integrity and authenticity cannot justify a morally bad means. Even for the sincere believer, it cannot justify grave injustice. I don't doubt the sincerity of the Aztecs, the ancient Aztecs, in practicing human sacrifice, or the sincerity of those in the history of various traditions of faith, including my own, who used coercion and even torture in the cause of what they believed was religiously required. But these things are deeply wrong and need not, certainly should not, be tolerated in the name of religious freedom. To suppose otherwise is to back oneself into the rather awkward position of supposing that violations of religious freedom and other injustices of equal gravity must be respected for the sake of religious freedom, and obviously that can't be right. Still, it seems to me that to overcome the powerful and broad presumption in favor of religious liberty, to be justified in requiring the believer to do something contrary to his faith, or forbidding the believer to do something that his faith requires, political authority must meet a heavy burden. The legal test in the United States, you probably don't need me to tell you, is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, at least as applied to the federal government, where it's still good law. And that's one of the ways of capturing the presumption and the burden. It doesn't have to be put in RFRA language. In different places it can be put in different ways, I suppose. But basically the thought is that to justify a law that bears negatively on people's religious beliefs and practices and their freedom to live in line with the moral laws they understand it, even a neutral law of general applicability, must be supported by what our courts call a compelling state interest and be advanced or prosecuted or protected by the least restrictive or intrusive means. Now we can debate, and this is exactly the place to debate, but I don't know that we want to do that today, as a matter of American constitutional law or as a matter of policy, whether it is or should be up to the courts or the legislatures to decide when exemptions to general neutral laws should be granted for the sake of religious freedom, or to determine when the presumption in favor of religious freedom has been overcome. That's really what the debate between Justice Scalia and Justice O'Connor was in the Oregon against Smith case, the Peyote Native American Indian Church case, the Peyote case. Should it be the legislatures or should it be the courts? Who's to decide on the exemptions? Who's to decide when the burden has been met by the state that would warrant, justify the state's imposing a rule or enforcing a rule that really would, however unfortunately, restrict the religious freedom of somebody against whom the rule is applied. But the substantive matter of what religious freedom demands from those who exercise the levers of state power should, it seems to me, be something that we can agree upon across the religious and political spectrums. It's an agreement that we had, if I recall correctly, back in 1993, 1994, when Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Those of you who are my age or older, the youngsters probably won't know all that much about this, but if you're of a certain age, you will recall that the Smith decision was considered a horrible decision, not only by people on the left, but by people on the right. It generated an amazing coalition. It was a great force of unification. Scalia's judgment in Smith, Peyote case, unified the moral majority and People for the American Way, the Christian Coalition, and the American Civil Liberties union. Everybody was on the same side. The case was an outrage. The decision was an outrage. It read religious freedom, free exercise of religion, out of the Constitution, as our friend Father Richard John Newhouse said, Pat. It's got to be rectified. It's got to be set right. And so, by overwhelming majorities, bipartisan majorities in both houses of Congress, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed. Signed into law enthusiastically, not in the middle of the night in secret, enthusiastically by President Clinton. We did have a consensus on what seems to me to be the right principle for establishing the limits of claims to religious freedom, since it can't be unlimited. Now, let me conclude with a few words about the centrality, and one might even say priority of religious freedom among the basic civil liberties. I'm saying this kind of tentatively because even as I say it, I appreciate the arguments that actually can be made against the particular points I'm making. But let me say this. Observed from a certain perspective, any basic liberty might be assigned a kind of priority. I am confident in this. Free speech, for example, which is so essential to the enterprise of Republican government, and in truth, good government of any kind, could be said to be the number one liberty. And if you consider the folks my age will remember the work of Alexander Meiklejohn on the important instrumental value of free speech to the functioning of self-government, of free institutions, of democracy, Republican government. Or freedom of association and assembly. I mean, without that, how can you run a democracy? I mean, you've got to be able to form political organizations, political parties. You need to be able to protest. You need to be able to organize. Or the right of self-defense and the defense of one's family and community. You know, if we left the University of Pennsylvania Law School and drove for half an hour over to the Bucks County Tea Party Patriots pig roast, which I once attended, you will find people who will say the number one right on which the others depend is the right to self-protect. If you can't protect yourself, that's why the importance of the Second Amendment. It really should be the first. Because if you can't protect yourself, then what good is free speech? What good is freedom of religion? What good is the right of assembly? In any event, one might note in the case of any of these rights that its collapse would place all the others in jeopardy. Now, there's certainly truth in the idea that civil liberty is a sort of seamless garment. Basic civil liberties support each other. And in certain ways, they even depend on each other. Tyrannical regimes may begin by dishonoring one or a few basic liberties, but they get around in the end to dishonoring all of them as soon as the perceived interests of the rulers or dominant classes incentivize them to do so. Still, and here comes the controversial part, there's a special sense in which freedom of religion has priority, does have priority, or at least a sort of pride of place. It's rightly labeled America's first freedom, not merely because it's listed first in our Bill of Rights, though it is, and not only because of its foundational historical role in the establishment of the conditions of free institutions, but even more importantly because it protects an aspect of our flourishing as human persons which is architectonic in the way we lead our lives. Religion concerns ultimate things, existential questions, questions of human nature, dignity, and destiny. In the focal cases, it represents our efforts to bring ourselves into a relationship of friendship with transcendent sources of meaning and value, if there are any. Or at a minimum, to determine whether there are any, or what the truth of the matter is. A truth that's bound to be life-shaping, that's bound to affect, guide, shape our other decisions in lots of ways. That's what I mean by architectonic. Our religious questioning, understanding, judging, and practicing shapes what we do not only in the specifically religious aspects of our lives, prayer, liturgy, fellowship, Bible study, and so forth, but in every aspect of our lives. I speak to lots of different religious groups, different faiths, Jewish groups, Muslim groups, Catholic groups, evangelical groups, LDS, Mormon groups, and so forth. And one of the common threads, lots of common threads to religion, actually, but one of the common threads is, whenever I'm speaking to a religious person, it doesn't matter what religion they are, they insist that religion is not something that pertains only to prayer, spiritual exercises, what goes on in the temple or church or mosque or before meals or at bedtime on your knees. They all say, no matter what the faith, it pertains to the whole of their lives. It shapes their lives in business. It shapes their social lives. It shapes the way they interact with people in the ordinary, mundane affairs of life. Buying the groceries, stopping to get gas in the car. There's this kind of sense in which religion is comprehensive. It helps us indeed view our lives as a whole and direct our choices and activities in ways that have integrity, both in the moral sense of that term, which is probably the one you hear when you hear me say integrity, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, in the broader sense, that is, of having a life that hangs together, that makes sense, that isn't just haphazard and piecemeal. It integrates the whole of our lives, the various dimensions of our lives. You know, talk to a devout Muslim, an Orthodox Jew, a devout Catholic, a Mormon. They'll tell you about the way in which their faith enables their lives to hang together as a whole. It plays that role. For non-believing people, for secular people, other things play that role. But for religious people, it is the religious faith that plays that role, characteristically. Now, if I'm right about religion, as in this broad sense of in which I'm using the term, as the main good that is protected by religious freedom, I need to note that religion is not the only basic human good. It's not the only aspect of our well-being and fulfillment. And that can be affirmed even by somebody who does believe, as I believe, that religion pertains to the whole of life and has this architectonic role. Nor need the religious person hold, and I certainly don't hold, that the other basic human goods, the other aspects of our well-being, are mere means to the further or fuller realization of the good of religion. As if in the end it's just all about religion, and anything that's not religion is a means. Why do I study Shakespeare? As a way of getting to heaven. Why do I watch Monday Night Football? Because it has such great spiritual significance. It's a means. No. The religious person can recognize, and I believe should recognize, that there are many basic, irreducible aspects of our well-being and flourishing, including the good of religion, but not exclusively the good of the religion, although religion plays a distinctively architectonic role. Religion is an intrinsic and constitutive aspect of our integral flourishing, not the only one, and also a good that really does play that shaping and integrating role for religious people with respect to all the other intrinsic and constitutive aspects of our well-being and fulfillment. And finally, there is the critical role of religion, and thus of religious freedom, in civil society, in carrying out essential health, education, and welfare functions, those that government cannot itself do especially well, even in circumstances like ours where you have a large administrative state that does a whole lot of health, education, and welfare stuff. You still rely on religion to carry some of that burden, and particularly those parts of the burden that have to do with dealing with people as very concrete individuals with their particular problems, where they need to be known by name. And their strengths and weaknesses and vulnerabilities and opportunities need to be known specifically. Religious groups, as Professor John DiIulio has shown, and Penn Professor John DiIulio has shown in his own scholarship so brilliantly, religious institutions are really quite critical for the delivery of those sorts of services. And on top of that, of course, there's the importance of religion and religious freedom, then, in limiting the scope of government and checking the power of the state, ensuring that there are alternative authority structures in the society and mediating structures that provide a buffer between the individual and the central power of the state. Religion provides those structures, and where it flourishes and is healthy, well, it isn't always healthy, Where it is, it's among the key institutions of civil society, providing that buffer between the individual and the state. This is a vital way in which religion and religious institutions, when they respect the legitimate autonomy of the secular sphere and avoid illiberalism, or time-serving subservience to the state, or theocracy, serve the common good. So you don't have to believe that religion will always be playing a positive role. There's nothing that will guarantee that religion, or even a particular religion, will always play a positive role in society. It could invade the autonomy of the legitimate autonomy of the secular sphere. Religious freedom can be violated in the name of religious freedom. Religion can become an instrumentality of the state. Think of how the czars used religion, or how Putin's using religion today. Or theocracy. Think of Iran or Saudi Arabia. But in the face of tyrannical regimes, when religion is healthy and flourishing, if it can avoid corruption and co-optation, it really can serve the common good, even more dramatically by doing, for example, the kind of thing the Catholic Church did in the face of communist tyranny in Poland, beginning that pulling on the thread which ultimately unravels communism in Eastern Europe and eventually in relatively short order in Russia. The Catholic Church provided an authority structure, an alternative authority structure, a base of operation for opponents of tyranny. My work, Dan was kind enough to point out that I'm chairing now the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, so I'm having to learn a lot, most of it very bad news, about the conditions and state and circumstances of religious freedom in the world today. And it is really mostly bad news. And one of the things I've been learning, since China is one of the great religious freedom offenders in the world, the Chinese regime, I've been learning that the Chinese are really keenly aware of what happened because the Soviets let the Catholic Church live in Poland. They don't want that to happen to them. They don't want to repeat the mistake of the Soviets, letting that alternative authority. So you wonder why the Chinese leadership is out to crush not only the Tibetan Buddhists, you can understand that, or why they don't want the actual Catholic Church to function in China. They got an alternative phony one that they've set up. Or why they don't like the Protestant house churches or some of the Buddhist movements. But this also explains why on earth they are so paranoid about the Falun Gong. I don't know if you guys know much about it. I didn't until I took this job, but they're not very dangerous. And they're not really political. They're not even religious, in our sense. But they do represent an alternative civil society, an institution of civil society independent of the state, that just could function the way the Catholic Church functioned in Poland. So smash them. Religion can, in other words, contribute to both the theory and practice of resistance against tyranny, but only where, as I keep repeating, it's basically healthy, that is uncorrupted, unbought off, unco-opted, and capable of providing resources for prophetic witness. That's what Poland was really all about. That's what John Paul II and the great return to Poland after he'd been elected Pope was really all about. It was a prophetic witness that ignited the fire. Now, this is one more reason, it seems to me, to cherish religious freedom and to push back hard against forces that threaten to diminish it, especially when those threats come from government. Well, okay, thanks very much, and I'll be happy to do some Q&A if you like. I don't know, do we have time? Or you want to do a little Q&A? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a rhetorical question. Thank you for that amazing lecture about something, and I'm not trying to play gotcha, where you sort of almost assumed that there was a common vocabulary, and I'm not sure for the other parts of the lecture that there is. Namely, you said that, of course, there are limits like human sacrifice. suicide bombings against women, or some might cite abortion, certainly the treatment of women in the world today, beyond just taboo. Do we have something beyond just taboo to say this is where the limits of civilization start and you have to
No, that's not a rhetorical question. That's a real question, and it's a good question.
Oh, I just meant as far as the rhetoric, where we turn.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the question is not really actually one of rhetoric. The question is, do we have a substantive, rational understanding of justice and morality that would enable us, at least to the satisfaction of our own consciences, to identify cases where we believe we are justified in using what resources we are, again, within what resources we have available to us, within the bounds not only of prudence, but of justice itself, for intervening in how other people or other cultures conduct themselves. Can we really thread the needle between being cultural imperialists who impose something on somebody else just because it's our way of doing things, and being morally sound, Martin Luther King type activists in the cause of justice, because there really is a truth that we have access to, and that we're confident we have access to, even with intellectual humility and self-criticism, that we're believe we, all things considered, got this right and are therefore willing to act on it. At our commission, at the Commission on Religious Freedom, we're tasked to do that every day. It's a statutory obligation. The Religious Freedom Act of 1990, International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, IRFA, creates our commission. It created the Office in the State Department for Religious Freedom. It created the the at-large ambassadorship for religious freedom, with a view to informing our government about how to use American power to mitigate religious freedom abuses by those with whom we enter into diplomatic relations, and how to advance the cause of religious freedom in other countries. That's what it's all about. Now, if you're really a skeptic about morality or justice, I don't know where you go. I mean, if you think it's just we have nothing more than the ick factor or the taboos, well, you can call that two ways. You can say, well, therefore I have no justification in ever intervening in how people do things, whether it's Aztec sacrifice or the sati in India or whatever. Or you can say, since there's no morality, there's no moral truth, there's certainly nothing morally wrong with stopping people from doing stuff that we think is distasteful. So, full speed ahead, off we go. Now, I'm in neither of those camps. I mean, I myself think that there is a rational morality. There's a rational basis for ethics. We can identify in fear and trembling, with intellectual humility and self-criticism, we can identify moral norms, including norms of justice and human rights, that we can be confident enough in to apply in good conscience, subject to side constraints having to do with the prudence of acting. It's not always prudent even to do the right thing, something that's in itself the right thing, and subject to the norms of justice, because sometimes you can commit injustices in the cause of justice. The world's a complicated place. That's possible. You can never rest content to say, well, look, it's a just cause, therefore we can do anything to advance it. The means have to be just, even if you're pursuing just ends. And that will limit what, say, the United States can do about, let's say, the persecution of the Rohingya Muslims by the Buddhist majority in Burma. All right, you're supposed to say Myanmar today. It'd be great if we could just go in there and stop that. But there are reasons of prudence and reasons of justice that limit the means of. Now, we can still do some things. We can put some diplomatic pressure on them. There's some sanctions that we might prudently apply, I think. Our commission has made some recommendations in that direction. But we can't just send in the troops to vindicate the rights, genuinely being brutally violated of the Rohingya. So is that responsive to your question?
I guess that's part of it, and I would agree with all of that.
Okay, give me the rest. What have I not addressed?
You gave a great case for how Newman saw conscience acting and what its basis were. You really went into the basis for Mill's view of conscience as well. What is the basis, and you said that you have one, what is our rhetorical basis then for saying, even allowing for differences between religion, there are a few things, even if you think that God's demanding, you can't cut somebody's heart out, even if you have a whole tradition. You can't do this.
Okay. If we lay aside skepticism, the idea that there is no rational basis for ethics, I think that things break down into, well, you can always draw more, but there are three schools of thought that I think really warrant, three basic general approaches that really warrant our consideration, our careful, conscientious consideration. And there are variants of these, and you could add some side notes to them. But basically, they're the utilitarian theory of Mill and Bentham, defended today by lots of people, including my colleague, Professor Peter Singer at Princeton. There's what usually these days goes by the label the Kantian approach, which attempts to identify the categorical imperatives, the basic abstract principles of reason itself that we must, in order to be upright, line our actions up with. Acting on the maxim that we can at the same time will to be a universal law, or treat humanity, whether in the person of yourself or another, always as an end or never as a means only. And then the third is broadly, roughly speaking, the Aristotelian account, which is the one that you heard echoes of, certainly at a minimum, in my thought, because that's my way of doing it. Now, my particular approach, my particular Aristotelian approach to these things, is to try to derive norms of conduct, moral norms, whether at a general level, like do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, or at a somewhat more specific level, like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, or at a very specific level, like don't hit your sister, deriving them from a consideration of the various aspects of human well-being and fulfillment integrally conceived. So I think what moral norms are at any of those three levels, and there are lots of in-betweens, are specifications of the integral directiveness or prescriptivity of the human good. And by the human good, I don't mean some Platonic form out there somewhere. I mean the concrete aspects of our well-being and flourishing, the things that we grasp as providing not just instrumental reasons for action, like money or insurance policies, but constitutive reasons, things that are worth doing, having, protecting for their own sake. The good of friendship, the good of intellectual life, pursuit of knowledge, development of skills in football or ballet or chess or what have you, and a range of other things, none of which by itself is a moral norm, but which taken together, I think, can enable us rationally to identify principles of action that are moral norms precisely in that they are principles of reason. They are undefeated or conclusive reasons for our actions, often giving us reasons not to pursue certain ends that we have reasons to pursue, but which reasons are defeated. For example, because friendship really is a true human good, it's not just a means to other things, it's a constitutive human good. You wouldn't want to be the friend of somebody who regarded your friendship just as a means, like he's your friend because you get invited to all the good parties and that way your dad's going to get him a good job in the financial services. That's not friendship. That kind of an instrumental relationship is not friendship. But you can grasp the point of friendship where each of the parties, each of the friends is willing the good of the other for the sake of the other, right? So that's a good thing. You would want to say, well, people should act for that good. Not all the time. There are lots of other goods. There are competing things to do with your time. Sometimes you want to read Shakespeare. Sometimes you want to put your feet up and relax. There are various things you want to do. But friendship at least provides an intelligible reason for action. But it's not a moral norm. For this reason, you can have friendship can provide a reason that would be a justifying. Would give you a rational basis for doing things that are plainly immoral. Let's say, which is true, my friend Professor Deneen over here and I are really good friends. We're bosom pals. Now, let's say that it becomes, there's a rumor circulating in our intellectual community that I had done something really disgraceful, something really bad. What's something really bad? Oh, embezzled from my research account. That's the kind of ultimate sin for academia, embezzled from my research account. And so this rumor is going all around, and our colleagues, Patrick was at Princeton with me for a while, let's say our colleagues, are all buzzing with this. Did you hear, that self-righteous hypocrite